Good evening, this is Pastor Bob, Sunrise Community Church here in Allenstown, New Hampshire, 44 Pinewood Road. Glad you're all with us this evening. We got some exciting news today. The governor has lifted the order for the churches. He said we can open immediately. We will have our first service back at the church on June 7th. That's not day after tomorrow, but 1 week from this Sunday, June 7th at 10 a.m. We'll have service here at the church. We're looking forward to it. So we're excited about that. That is good news indeed. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the idea that we'll get through this. You know, I was thinking this week just about God and how great His ways are. And Isaiah chapter 55 verse 8 says, "My ways are far beyond anything that you could imagine." And this week I recognized just how much, or I was thinking just how much we really need, how important God is in our lives, how He comforts us when we're hurting. He brings peace in the midst of tragedy and despair. And many times when I'm contemplating just how much God means to me and how great God is, I'm reminded of a book written by A.W. Tozier. And the title of that book is The Lord of the Impossible. And that's what I think about our God many times, because I've seen Him heal marriages, bind up broken hearts after the loss of a child or a sibling, heal the sick, and sometimes give comfort and peace that really doesn't make any sense, because it's in the middle of a situation, illness that might actually prove to be fatal, but I've seen His peace come in there, and many times I've seen Him do what is impossible by human standards through the work, through the hands and feet of other human beings. This week has been a very busy week here at the church, and in the middle of it we've seen tragedy, we've seen loss, we've seen heartache. This week I've prayed with a grandmother that has lost her grandson, a mother who's lost her son, another wife and mother who's going through a divorce and is heartbroken, and a daughter who is searching for answers and loves. Another friend who has been given a wonderful promotion at his work, but with it comes the difficulties of the increased demands on his time and the need to actually lay out a plan of action that gets everyone working for the same goal. Life is complicated. It's difficult, and many times it's messy. And in the midst of this, we have a God that is always there. Even when it seems like we're all alone in our pain, in our loneliness, and in our confusion. While I was praying this week with this young girl and her mom, I found myself saying things like, "You'll get through this. It won't be painless. It may not be quick, but God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish. Don't despair. With God's help, you will get through this." That's crazy of me, right? How dare I say such words? Where did I get the nerve to speak such a promise into a tragedy, actually into a pit, a deep, dark pit, so steep the boy could not climb out of it. Had he been able to, why, his brothers would have just shoved him back down, because they were the ones that threw him in there in the first place. Genesis chapter 37, verses 23 through 25, it's the story of Joseph. "So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And then they took him and they cast him into the pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. It was an abandoned cistern. Jagged rocks and roots were coming out of its sides. The 17-year-old boy is at the bottom of it. His hands are bound. His ankles are tied. He's laying on his side. His knees are pulled up to his chest. He's cramped in a small space. His eyes, no doubt, are wide with fear, and his voice is hoarse from screaming. And it wasn't that his brothers didn't hear him. They just didn't care." 22 years later, they would confess that in Genesis chapter 42, verse 21, where it says, "We saw his anguish, the anguish of his soul, when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear him." These are the great-grandsons of Abraham. The name of Jesus Christ will appear on their family tree. They're of the equivalent of royalty in scriptures. Yet on this day, they're the Bronze Age version of a dysfunctional family. hearts as hard as the Canaanite desert much mattered more than their brother did. They despised him. Genesis chapter 37, verses 4, verses 5, verses 8, and verses 11, it says things like this. They hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. They hated him even more. They hated him. His brothers envied them. And here's why. Their father pampered Joseph like a prize calf. You see, Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel, but only one loved, Rachel. And when Rachel died, Jacob kept her memory alive by fawning all over Joseph. The brothers worked all day. Joseph played all day. They wore clothes from a second-hand store, and Jacob gave Joseph a hand-stitched, multicolored cloak with embroidered sleeves. They slept in the bunkhouse. Joseph had a queen-size bed in his own room. While they ran the family herd, Joseph stayed home. They spat on the very sight of Joseph. To say this family was in crisis would be an understatement. And the brothers caught Joseph one day far from home, 60 miles away from his father's protection, and they went nuclear on him. They stripped Joseph of his tunic, and they took him and they cast him into the pit. They wanted not only to kill him, but also to hide his body. This was a murderous plot from the get-go. Genesis chapter 37, verse 20 says, "What shall we say? Some wild beast devoured him?" You see, Joseph didn't see this coming. He didn't climb out of bed that morning and think, you know, I should wear clothes with some extra padding today because today's the day I'm going to get thrown into a hole. The attack caught him off guard. I'll bet yours did too. I'll bet yours did. You see, Joseph's pit came in the form of a cistern. Maybe your pit came in the form of a diagnosis or some kind of tragic injury. Joseph was thrown into the hole, and you? Maybe you were thrown into a divorce and abandoned, or thrown into a loss and isolated, or into an unemployment line and forgotten. The pit. It's a kind of death. Some people never recover. Life is reduced to only one goal, to get out of this pit and never get hurt again. But that's not so easily done, is it? Because pits don't have easy exits. In Joseph's story, well, it gets worse before it gets better. Abandonment leads to enslavement. Enslavement leads to entrapment, and finally imprisonment. He was sucker punched. He was sold out. He was mistreated. People made promises to him only to break them. And they offered him gifts only to take them back. And yet Joseph never gave up. Bitterness never staked its claim in Joseph's heart. Anger never turned into hatred. His heart never hardened, and his resolve never vanished. Not only did he survive, he thrived. He ascended like a helium balloon. An Egyptian official promoted him to chief servant. The prison warden placed him over all the other prisoners, and Pharaoh, the highest ruler on the planet at that time, tapped Joseph on the shoulder to serve as the prime minister. By the end of his life, Joseph is the second most powerful man of his generation. It is not hyperbole to say that Joseph saved the world from starvation. How would that look on your resume, huh? How would that look? Joseph, son of Jacob, graduated with honors from the University of Hard Knocks, director of global effort to save humanity, succeeded. How? How did he do this in the midst of tragedy? Well, we don't have to speculate. 20 years later, the roles are reversed. Joseph is the strong one now, and the brothers are the weak one. And they come to him in dread because they fear that he'll settle the score and throw them into a pit of his own making. But Joseph didn't do that. And in his explanation, we find his inspiration. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20 says this, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result to preserve many people alive." You see, in God's hands, intended evil becomes eventual good. Do I need to say that again? In God's hands, intended evil becomes eventual good. Nothing in this story glosses over the presence of evil. Blood stains and tear stains are everywhere. Joseph's heart is broken because of disloyalty and miscarried justice, yet time and time again, God redeemed the pain. The torn robe became a royal robe. The pit became a palace. The broken family grew old together. The very acts intended to destroy God's servant turned out to strengthen him. He says, "You meant evil against me," Joseph told his brothers. He's actually using a verb here in the original text that has its meaning that traces back to the idea of weaving. What he is really saying is, you wove evil, but God rewove it together for good. You see, God stretches the yarn and intertwines the colors, the pains and the pleasures together. Nothing escapes God's reach. Every king, every politician, every germ, every molecule are at his command. He passes the shuttle back and forth across the generations, and as he does, a design emerges. Satan weaves and then God reweaves. And then Joseph said, God meant it for good in order to bring about. That word, in order to bring about, it's a construction term. It describes a task or a building project like the one we put up with here in Concord, New Hampshire, back on Main Street a few years ago, when downtown was tore up. It was just not even pleasurable to be down there. They were tearing the roads up and they were doing everything, and they were trying to put it back together. The road was torn. It was a mess. And now you go down there and it's beautiful. It took time, but the mess that we put up with turned into something beautiful. Look at Joseph's story. Such disarray. Brother dumping brother, entitlement, family feuds, famines. Satan's logic was simple. Destroy the family of Abraham and thereby destroy his seed, Jesus Christ. All hell breaks loose against our own Jacob's boys. But watch God, the master builder. Watch him do it as he'll clear the debris, as he'll stabilize the structure. You see the evil portrayed in Genesis 37, where it says they cast him into the pit, becomes the triumph of Genesis 50, when he says he gives life to many people. God redeemed the story of Joseph, and he can redeem your story as well. You will get through this. Oh, I know. You fear you won't. We all do when we're in those situations. We fear the depression will never lift. The yelling will never stop. The pain will never leave. Here in the pit, surrounded by the steep walls and the angry people, we wonder, will it ever get better? Will the load ever get lightened? We feel stuck. We feel trapped, locked in, predestined for failure. Will we ever exit this pit? Yes. Yes, you will. Deliverance is to the Bible what jazz music is to the Mardi Gras. Bold, brassy, and everywhere. Out of the lion's den for Daniel. Out of prison for Peter. The whale's belly for Jonah. Goliath's shadow for David. The storm for the disciples. The disease for the lepers. The doubt for Thomas. The grave for Lazarus. And out of the shackles for Paul. Through seems to be one of God's favorite words. Sharon and I, one of our favorite verses is Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. It says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, nor the flame will scorch you. Oh, it won't be painless. Have you cried or wept your final tear? Maybe not. Have you received your last round of therapy? Not necessarily. Will you become happy in a heartbeat? Not likely. Are you exempt from a trip to the cemetery? Does God guarantee you the absence of struggle and the abundance of strength? Not in this life, but he does pledge to reweave your pain for a higher purpose. Oh, it won't be quick. Joseph was 17 when he was abandoned by his brothers, and he was at least 37 when he saw them again. It took 120 years to prepare Noah for the flood. 80 years to prepare Moses for his work. God called young David to be the king and then returned him to the sheep pasture. God called Paul to be the apostle and then isolated him in Arabia for 3 years. Jesus was on the earth 3 decades before he built anything more than a kitchen table. How long will God take with you? You see, God's history is not redeemed in minutes. It's redeemed in lifetimes. But God will use this mess for good. You see, we see a mess. God sees the perfect opportunity to train, to test, and to teach you for your future. We see a prison. God sees a kiln. We call it Egypt. God calls it protective custody. We see Satan's tricks and ploys. God sees Satan tripped and foiled. Let me be clear here. You are a part of God's plan. You represent a challenge to Satan's plan. You carry something of God inside you, something noble, something holy, something the world needs: wisdom, kindness, mercy, skill. If Satan can neutralize you, he can mute your influence. The story of Joseph is in the Bible for a reason, to teach us that God prevails over evil. What Satan intends for evil, God redeems for good. Life in the pit stinks. It does. I won't lie about it. Yet, for all its rottenness, doesn't the pit do at least one thing? It forces us to look up. Someone from up there needs to come down here and give me a hand. I can't get out of this pit on my own. God did it for Joseph, and at the right time, in the right way, God will do it for you. This is Pastor Bob. Can't wait to see you in church. Remember, we start church next Sunday morning, June 7th at 10 a.m. God bless you and have a good day.